The crew observed the landings and takeoffs as they breathed in the fresh, cool air around them. The Great Lakes were lovely this time of year, and the pilots were starting to get a hang of landing and taking off of this short, squatty aircraft carrier. Crew members kept track of who passed and who didn't, and it was difficult to believe from looking at their ship that she'd once been a paddle wheel passenger ship. Welcome to Shipwreck Sunday. My name is Eleanor. Just a quick disclaimer for a younger audience before we dive in. This story may be disturbing to some, so viewer discretion is advised. Okay everyone, let's get into it. Thanks to John Bango on YouTube for the suggestion to cover this ship. I never realized there were aircraft carriers on the Great Lakes. This one should prove pretty interesting. Before she was an aircraft carrier, however, she was a sidewheel paddle steamship. USS Sable was once named SS Greater Buffalo, and she was owned by the Detroit and Cleveland Navigation Company based in Detroit, running her route from Buffalo, New York to Detroit, Michigan. She was built in 1924 by the American Shipbuilding Company of Lorain, Ohio, being designed by marine architect Frank E. Kirby. If his name sounds familiar, it's because he's widely regarded as one of the greatest naval architects in American history, and he specialized in paddle wheel and steamship design. He's also considered the father of modern ice-breaking technology, so he was quite important in the shipping world. Greater Buffalo was designed by this brilliant mind, costing $3.5 million to build. She was laid down as hull number 00786 sometime in 1924, being launched on October 27th of that year and completed shortly after that. Before we get any further into her career, let's look at her design and specs. SS Greater Buffalo's displacement was listed at 7,739 gross registered tons, and as USS Sable, she displaced 6,584 long tons. As Greater Buffalo, she was 518.7 feet in length, had a beam of 58 feet, and a height of 21.3 feet, spanning 7 decks. As USS Sable, the only thing different here was her length, which was increased to 535 feet in length. As SS Greater Buffalo, her U.S. official number was 223663, and her code letters were WSBH up until 1942. Then, as USS Sable, her code letters would change to NYZP. She was adorned with 3 funnels painted with dark paint, and the body of the ship was also darkly colored, which greatly contrasted against her light superstructure. As for propulsion, she had 9 boilers that powered a 3-cylinder inclined compound steam engine, which was built by American Shipbuilding. Each cylinder had the following diameters. One was 66 inches, and 2 were 96 inches, by 108 inches stroke. She also had 3 100-kilowatt turbo generators for ship lighting and operation. This setup was capable of producing 1,915 nominal horsepower. All of this powered one 32.75-foot in diameter sidewheel and 11 paddles that were 14.833 feet long and 5 feet wide, at 30 revolutions a minute. This allowed her to travel at average surface speeds of 18 knots. This was balanced by rudders at both ends of the ship that increased maneuverability. Now that we know the nitty-gritty of her specs, let's get into her design aspects. Though the main architecture was designed by Frank E. Kirby, the interior design of the ship was left to W&J Sloan & Company of New York City, and they were to form their own adaptation of the Renaissance style. The ship's saloon spanned 2 decks, and she had room not only for her 300 crew in their cabins stationed at the lowest deck fore and aft of the ship's machinery, but up to 1,500 berths for passengers among 650 staterooms. On the ship was a transportation-themed mural painted by 2 New York City artists, Franklin Paris and Frederick Wiley, and it was 22 feet long. At the stern of the ship, on her promenade deck, lie a smoking room with a row of windows that arced from one side of the ship to the next, and each room was connected by telephones on a central switchboard that was located in the ship's lobby. This is big for the 20s. You don't hear about having telephones and a telephone operator on a steamship very often. If you were willing to spend a larger chunk of change, you could get one of her more luxurious staterooms that featured a balcony, couch, and private bathroom. This was still during the early days of private bathrooms on ships. Lots of ships in the Edwardian era going into the 20s still had public restrooms for the majority of passengers. A private bathroom is a luxury I'll never take for granted again. The dining room of Greater Buffalo could seat 375 comfortably, with amenities offered like washed and cooled air, which screamed air conditioning to me, and that's fabulous, and distilled water. The difference between regular purified water, like what you get out of a tap, and distilled water is actually pretty noticeable. Distilled water is a type of purified water that has had both contaminants and minerals removed, while purified water has had chemicals and contaminants removed, but it still may contain some minerals. Distilled water has less of a metallic taste because of the removed minerals, and this can make it a little blander. In the hallways and staircases, there were footlights installed, much like you would see in a common movie theater today. And this allowed the main lighting to be turned off for the comfort of passengers at night, and it didn't compromise on safety. Greater Buffalo could also carry vehicles. She was capable of carrying 103 vehicles on her main deck and 1,000 tons of cargo. At the time, this illustrious, innovative ship was given the fitting nickname of Majestic of the Great Lakes. She also had many safety features that I appreciate. Safety was often below efficiency during the 1800s into the 1910s, and following the disaster of RMS Titanic, safety finally started rising to the top of the list where it should have been all along. Greater Buffalo had an automatic fire alarm system, a sprinkler system throughout the ship, and fire safety walls in order to protect against fire on board. And her hull was all steel with 11 watertight compartments and a double bottom divided into 16 watertight compartments. Dividing these compartments were watertight doors that were hydraulically powered and could be closed remotely from the safety of the engine room. To add an extra layer of protection, a full-time watchman was on duty around the clock, and she also had 12 60-person capacity lifeboats along with a wide array of floats and rafts. For navigation equipment, she had high-powered searchlights at each end of the ship, a Haynes automatic sounding machine, and a Sperry gyro compass with a log. For anyone not familiar, a sounding machine is used for depth sounding, which is measuring the depth of a body of water. Data taken from soundings are used in bathymetry to make maps of the floor of a body of water, such as the seabed topography. She was a well-equipped vessel. And you could say this is a well-equipped video. If you're enjoying this video, leave me a like, subscribe to the channel for more content, and let me know down in the comments section below. Okay, now that we've bolstered our egos over here, let's get into her career. SS Greater Buffalo and her sister ship, SS Greater Detroit, were ordered after a period of company growth for the Detroit and Cleveland Navigation Company during World War I, and these two ships were going to service the Great Lakes as excursion vessels. These two ships were among the largest sidewheel paddle steamships on the Great Lakes when they each entered service. Her maiden voyage took place on May 13, 1925, as she departed Detroit for Buffalo with a large number of passengers, including the likes of the president of the shipping board at the time, T.V. O'Connor. At the time, SS Greater Buffalo would serve as a palatial overnight service ship carrying up to 1,500 passengers from Buffalo to Detroit, and the guests had the delight of being entertained by an orchestra for dancing in the main dining room after dinner and radio programming in the main salon. Television was not invented back then, but radio was all the rage, and it helped connect our world in ways we'd never had before. Greater Buffalo and other ships in her fleet also allowed passengers to carry their cars, and this was highly convenient as the automobile increased in normality and popularity. Unfortunately, this wave of success was short-lived, as by the end of the Roaring Twenties, the world sank into the Great Depression. The Great Depression lasted from 1929 until 1939 and was a severe global economic downturn that affected many countries all over the globe. It became apparent after a crash in the stock market in the United States, leading to this period of economic depression. We've seen similar instances in recent history, like the Great Recession starting in December of 2007 and lasting into June of 2009, leading to a lot of firings and layoffs in jobs and a crash in the housing market. My family was not affected by the recession very much, and I'm incredibly fortunate for that. Many lost their jobs, homes, and livelihoods during this time, and in July of 2009, a new minimum wage was established in the United States, raising the minimum wage from $6.55 an hour to $7.25 an hour. The Great Depression and the financial hardship it brought along with it would see Greater Buffalo and Greater Detroit pulled from service from 1930 through 1935. This was devastating for her owners, as were the union disputes and worker strikes that happened simultaneously. In 1934, she gained her code letters WSBH following a worldwide change in code lettering. After this, in 1936, Greater Buffalo was docked at Cleveland and used as a floating hotel for attendees of the Republican Convention that year. Reportedly, Greater Buffalo snapped free from her moorings and drifted out into the harbor during a storm, but she was recovered and brought back to the moor by harbor tugs. Greater Buffalo and Greater Detroit would be removed from service again in 1938, only to be returned back to service in 1939. Also in 1939, on September 1st, Nazi Germany invaded Poland and thus began World War II. Europe was thrust into war at this point, and the United States remained mostly removed from it until the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941 in Honolulu, Hawaii by the Imperial Japanese Navy. After this, there was an increased need for large ships that could be converted into Navy training aircraft carriers for pilot training. The Great Lakes was a spectacular place for this training, since the Great Lakes is safely within the United States, but they are large enough that the weather behaves much like it does on the ocean. Not only this, but Greater Buffalo and her new sister ship, also designed by Frankie Kirby, SSC&B, were great candidates for conversion. Following conversion, Greater Buffalo's deck would be 2/3 the length of an Independence-class aircraft carrier. The Navy figured if pilots could handle taking off and landing on a short flight deck, then they'd excel at the standard length. Active duty combat ships were needed for combat and couldn't be used for training generally, so using Greater Buffalo on the Great Lakes made her a safe option, out of reach of enemy mines and submarines. The Navy and the War Shipping Administration acquired the steamship on August 7, 1942, to convert her into a training aircraft carrier, and they renamed her Sable on September 19, 1942. It is reported that while SS Greater Buffalo made her final departure from Detroit, she was saluted by many on board other ships in the area, and that goes to show how beloved she was in the area. She'd become USS Sable at the Erie plant of American Shipbuilding Company in Buffalo, New York, with the cabins and superstructure of the ship being removed to reveal a flat main deck. Using additional supports, a steel flight deck was installed instead of the originally planned Douglas fir wooden deck similar to that installed on USS Wolverine, formerly SSC&B. Immediately, I felt disappointed upon learning this, but the steel deck had its own advantages. The steel deck allowed Sable to be used for testing of a wide variety of non-skid coatings that were applied directly to the flight deck. Along the flight deck were 8 sets of arresting cables to hold down airplanes. The bridge island, or new superstructure, was built up on the starboard side of the ship along with outriggers forward of this for storing damaged planes. A lecture room with projection equipment was on the main deck, and it was large enough to host 40 pilots, and there was bunks for 21 of them. She also had a sick bay, operating room, laundry, tailor shop, cafeteria-style galley for the crew, a mess hall for the officers, crew quarters, a refrigerator, and multiple storerooms. She didn't have a hangar deck, elevators, or armament since she was to be used for training for landings and takeoffs primarily. Most of the crew assigned to Sable prior to her commissioning were survivors of USS Lexington, which had been lost during the Battle of the Coral Sea. USS Sable was commissioned as a training ship on May 8, 1943. Sable was fully capable of educating and training pilots with the support of her crew. And our patrons help support us to keep creating. This episode couldn't be possible without our lovely patrons. Thank you all so much. If you'd like to support the channel and future episodes, go to patreon.com/shipwrecksunday to join. Let's get into USS Sable's training duty. Now completed as USS Sable, she left Buffalo on May 22, 1943, traveling to her new home port of Chicago, Illinois, and she arrived later on May 26th. She docked at the Navy Pier alongside her sister, now USS Wolverine, and they were in what was casually nicknamed the Corn Belt Fleet. Sable and Wolverine were assigned to the 9th Naval District Carrier Qualification Training Unit, or CQTU, and they were used to qualify Navy pilots for carrier operations. If the pilots could handle taking off and landing on decks that were shorter and lower to the water than standard aircraft carriers, the belief is that they would easily transition to something larger. Pilot training was conducted 7 days a week in an effort to qualify pilots quickly, and within the first 9 hours of her first day of service, she already qualified 59 aviators. Things weren't all peachy, however, with one glaring issue. Because of the lower top speed and height of Sable, there wasn't enough, quote, wind over deck to launch certain types of aircraft or even carry out training if the wind was calm. She was used as a base for testing the experimental TDN-1 torpedo drone aircraft in August of 1943 as well. She'd continue training pilots until the end of World War II. World War II ended in the Pacific with the atomic bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima in August of 1945, and the Japanese surrendered on September 2, 1945. After this, Sable was decommissioned on November 7th and stricken from the Naval Vessel Register on November 28th. Her fate was uncertain at this point, with a proposal being made by the Great Lakes Historical Society to have Sable preserved as a museum ship for Great Lakes history at Put-in Bay, Ohio, near the Commodore Perry Monument. Unfortunately, this deal fell through, and she only had one destination left. The ship was no longer needed for naval service, and returning such an aging ship back to her former glory would be a risky investment that would more than likely not pay off in the long run, and so she was sold by the Maritime Commission to H.H. Buncher Company on July 7, 1948, and was reportedly scrapped by July 27, 1948. In order to get through the Welland Canal, she was cut down before her journey to the shipbreaking yard in Hamilton, Ontario. It's reported that about 28 feet of her beam, along with 50 feet of the stern portion of her flight deck, were taken off before she was escorted by tugs. Even with these chunks removed, she still only had about 5 feet of clearance on each side while passing through the canal locks. Though her career was short, and she ended it in the scrapyard, she still had quite the legacy. Together, her and her sister ship USS Wolverine trained 17,820 pilots and 116,000 landings. Of these, 51,000 landings were on Sable alone. One of these pilots qualified was none other than 20-year-old Lieutenant Junior Grade George H.W. Bush, who would later go on to become the 41st President of the United States. His son, George W. Bush, would also become president, serving as the 43rd president. There was an estimated 135 to 300 aircraft lost during training, and as many as 35 have been salvaged, with the search for more continuing to this day. Both USS Sable and USS Wolverine served as the only freshwater, coal-driven, side paddle wheel aircraft carriers used by the United States Navy, making them unique and holding a special place in history. USS Sable earned both the American Campaign Medal and the World War II Victory Medal during her naval career. USS Sable and her sister ship USS Wolverine had incredibly interesting careers as aircraft carrier training ships for the Navy, and it easily distinguishes them from other World War II ships. Thank you again to John Bango for the interesting suggestion. If you liked that story and wanted to hear something similar, check out our World War II warships playlist in the cards. Stay tuned next week for the story of Exxon Valdez and the tragic oil spill that she will always be remembered for. Thank you for tuning into Shipwreck Sunday, have a great week, and we'll see you next time.